Hello, and welcome to the 6-hour endgame course taught by an international master, paikidze. I'll try to give you a quick introduction to what you're about to learn in this course. I have divided different topics into 6 chapters, and each chapter is designed to show you different aspects of practical endgames. We have general principles, material imbalances, rook endings, minor piece endings, pawn endings, and transition to the endgame. The goal of this course is to show you the most typical endgame patterns, explain how to study them, and hopefully give you the ability to implement these concepts in your own games right away. I have carefully chosen instructive examples from my own games, as well as some of the top Grandmaster games from the recent years. I hope you enjoy watching and learn a lot about practical endgames. Let's get started. Chapter 1, General Principles. In the example that I've chosen, you will see the importance of having active pieces. Sometimes all you need to do to win an endgame is activate some of your pieces. Also, one major difference between endgames and the earlier parts of the game is that while in the openings and middle games we try to find a safe place for our king and protect it as well as we can, in the endgames, king becomes one of those active pieces. So having an open king in the center is pretty common in the endgame and often a great decision. Creating weaknesses in your opponent's position so you can attack those targets is a pretty common concept, and it applies to all parts of the game, not just endgames, but you will see examples of those as well. And of course, tactics. Don't forget that just because there are only few pieces on the board, you can still look for tactics and win games by beautiful tactics. So let's begin. So in the first example, I was with black pieces. It's my game against Annie Wang from US Championship, but from a couple years ago. And we got this endgame, pretty typical rook endgame with some minor pieces. And I was very optimistic because I liked my position. And let's evaluate and see if black is actually better. So materially it's equal. Pawn structure is kind of interesting. Black has 2 pawns versus 1 on the queen side. In the center it's about the same. And on the king side, white has the advantage. They have this great pawn chain, a5, g4, and h3. Now besides that, when you have an endgame with more than just the pawns, it's important to evaluate the pieces. And in this case, black's rook is definitely more active than white's rook. So advantage black, an active rook. And knight and bishop, it's always difficult to evaluate which one is better because it always depends on a position. General principle is that in an open position, bishop is better than a knight. And if it's a close position with a lot of pawns, then usually knights are better. In this case, it's some of both. It's slightly open position, but we do have still a lot of pawns on the board. So currently, it's hard to say which one is better, but you will see that, as it turned out, black knight has a lot more potential in this position than white's bishop. So therefore, black does have an advantage, but it's still not easy to win. There is no clear plan to win. And in this case, what you need to do is try to create weaknesses in your opponent's position. Unless your opponent already has weaknesses, then finding a plan is a little bit easier. You just try to attack that weakness, whether it's a pawn or some square. So I made a good move here, h5. And my plan was to disconnect white's great pawn chain and create weaknesses. Of course, white shouldn't have allowed this to happen. My opponent did take on h5, and we'll discuss this later. What white should have played was king f3 to try to keep the pawn chain alive. But first, let me quickly show you why king f3 was the only move here for white. If white played rook g2, trying to protect g4, then black's got rook h1 move, and now white has a serious weakness on h3, and if they try to protect it, then a new weakness comes up, and white's definitely going to lose a pawn. One thing I also want to mention is that clearly black has more active position, but that doesn't necessarily mean that black's going to win. I've had plenty endgames on my own, and I've seen a lot of examples where you can defend and save an endgame just by defending it passively. So that's what white was doing. Yes, rook is passive on h2, but it is defending all the weaknesses, therefore it was working. So white should have played king f3, and this is what I was planning to do here. Exchange on g4, and then play rook d1. White has 3 weak pawns. Although they are defending g4 and b2, it feels like they cannot protect all 3 pawns all at once. However, somehow they do manage. If white goes king e2, attacking my rook, tactic here, knight g4 does not work, FYI, because of rook g2, and both of my pieces are hanging and I cannot protect both at the same time. And I was planning to play rook g1 here. And to me it looked like I was going to win g4 pawn anyways, and I had a huge advantage. But what I missed, and I think my opponent missed too, and that's the reason why she didn't play king f3, was that here white can save that pawn tactically. And it's by a simple move king f3, and now whether I take on g4 with a knight or rook doesn't matter. White's next move is going to be rook h7. Yeah, it turns out black also has a weakness, and it's the b7 pawn. It's just not that easy to get to that pawn for white. But here they do manage, and of course if black allows white to take on b7, then a6 pawn will fall shortly after. So after rook h7, black should take back, and king g4. And technically, yes, black stays up a pawn, but this endgame is unclear if it's winning at all. And if it is, it's not going to be simple. Because after rooks are gone, if you evaluate this position again, which I recommend you do that anytime you exchange any pieces in the endgame, you need to reevaluate the position. So here black is up a pawn, but has more passive king and more passive knight, because now knight or king has to defend g5 pawn, and it's much more difficult now to get to white's weaknesses now that we don't have a rook anymore. So yes, anyway, black is still better here, but it would have been much more difficult to win this than the endgame with the rooks. So after h5, my opponent took on h5, and now after knight takes, black clearly has an advantage. h3 and f5 pawn are very weak, and they're separated, which makes it easier to attack them. And now my knight becomes extremely active on f4, and you can clearly see that knight now is definitely better than the bishop. So my opponent played king d2, I played rook g1. Of course I want to leave the rook on the first rank and cause a lot of problems with it. White played bishop e2, knight f4, bishop g4. So on one hand, white bishop is terrible on g4. It's between the 2 pawns and it looks like a big pawn. But on the other hand, it is protecting both weaknesses, h3 and f5. So I feel like it was kind of necessary. However, it didn't help, because white has more weaknesses than h3 and f5. And that's a d4 pawn, which in a couple moves I managed to win. And after that, the endgame is winning. We made a bunch of moves here, moving back and forth, because we're both in time trouble. But yeah, white didn't make any big mistakes, and neither did black. I just took a couple moves to take this pawn. And after this, it's clearly easier for black to win this. Now they have an extra pawn, and the position is still better. We still have more active rook and the knight, and even king now. You can say that king on f6 is pretty active. It's forcing white's bishop to be on g4, protecting the f5 pawn. So extra material plus all better pieces definitely would lead to a win in the endgame. So yes, in the starting position it may look like Black has an advantage because they have active pieces, but nothing serious. And that is absolutely true. Unless black creates more weaknesses in white's position and weakens their position, it is not easy at all to make progress in endgames like this. Alright, I'm gonna move on to the next example. Alright, so the second example is also from black side. This was my game in the higher league of the Russian Championship. It's many years ago, but I was already an international master. And we got to this end game, and I pretty much assumed this game would end in a draw. And we have equal material and a very, very symmetrical position. The only difference is that white is a little bit more active and has a little more space. And more space is given by this e5 pawn. It definitely controls more of the position than any of my pawns. And that's about it, because yeah, white's rook is active on c6, but so is black's rook on a3. So everything else is about the same. But that's not what my opponent thought. And evaluating position correctly, especially in the endgame, is extremely important. If you overestimate your position, like my opponent did, it can end terribly. So, of course, this is just a draw endgame if white just plays some move like g3, and I can just stand and move rook and back and forth, or the king, or I can make small improvements like h6, but as I always like to say, be very careful before you move your pawns, because they can't go backwards, and moving a pawn changes the structure forever. So you have to be sure that you're not weakening anything, and that's the right move. So move like h6, you know, you're not weakening anything, and it's a safe move to play. So of course that's how game should have ended, just agreed on a draw here. But white overestimate the position here. I think it's mostly because the e5 pawn, it gives this imagination that white has an advantage because they have more space. But that's just simply not true. So my opponent played g4 with the goal to activate the pieces, go probably king e4, f5, and try to gain even more space and create weakness in my position somehow, and then win the game. g4 was a terrible mistake, after which black is immediately better if they make the right move. So I would recommend here you pause the video and try to find out why is g4 such a terrible move, and how can black take advantage of it. So after g4, black can play g5. Very aggressive move, but it's tactically correct. That's another thing that people don't think is common, tactics in the endgame. Yeah, they're just as common as in the middle games or openings, to be honest. So, and this is one of those cases. So with g5, of course, the plan is to just destroy white's pawn structure. And destroy that pawn chain, e5, f4, which was given the illusion that white had an advantage, and create weak pawns, and then try to win those pawns. The reason why g5 works is the tactical reason. If f takes g5, black has rook takes d3, and we end up with an extra piece, and of course easily won endgame. So since after g5 white cannot take back or push f5 because of the same reason, on f5 you would still take on d3, white is forced to just make a different waiting move and let black take on f4, which technically also wins a pawn. Doesn't only destroy white's pawn structure, but also wins material. So that's how bad g4 was. My opponent here played rook c7, which is a good looking move. G takes f4 check. Again, white king cannot recapture because the knight on d3 is hanging. King e4. Now white is planning to take on f4 with the knight, and seemingly not a lot of damage has been done yet, but that's not true either, because these pawns have been separated. I took the main pawn, which was the f pawn that was connecting all white's kingside pawns. So e5 pawn is now forever weak. But there's also another tactical reason that black manages to keep the extra pawn. First, we play king d8 to escape the pin and to be able to use our knight in this endgame. Now, another tactical variation, if white were to play rook b7, which is a good looking move, of course, it's every rook's dream to be on the 7th rank. While here it doesn't work tactically, again because of rook d3. If king takes knight c5, a different kind of fork, and white doesn't have any in-between moves to save the material. So rook went back to c2 to protect h2 and just be more close to its own pawns. And now black gives a check, rook a4, king has only one move going back to f3, and now black already saved the pawn, because it's not easy for white to take on f4 anymore. Anytime white plays knight f4, black takes knight e5, showing the weakness of the e5 pawn without this important supporter f pawn. So here I played rook d4, putting pressure on the knight that's defending the e5 pawn, because even though I have an extra pawn right now, it is a double pawn, so it's more difficult to use an extra pawn that's doubled than just an extra pawn. So I was trying to win the e5 pawn, so I would have this very strong pawn chain. An e6 pawn would be extra. So after rook d4, she has to move the knight, and I take on e5, and now I have protected future passed pawn on e6. She went king g3, and here you can argue that I didn't make the best move. I played knight g6, offering the knight exchange, but I was pretty sure that the rook endgame, if my opponent were to take on g6, would have been winning. I know a lot of rook endgames with just an extra pawn is not winning. There are many theoretical rook endgames you can learn that from, but this is not a typical theoretical case. We have 3 pawns against 2, but e and f pawn are kind of unstoppable. White doesn't have pawns in front of them, and because of that I thought it would be pretty easy to win. But now I realize that that's not entirely true because of white's next move, which is g5, and kind of fixing my kingside pawns. If I don't get to push both f and e pawn together, it's going to be pretty difficult to win this endgame. So I'm glad my opponent didn't play this, because I'm not sure if this is really winning for black. Of course, black has an advantage and will try anything, but it could be very, very difficult to win this. So instead of knight g6, I guess better move would have been just playing king d7 and slowly improving the position. There's no rush. White doesn't have any counterplay, so they still have to watch out and not lose another pawn on g4 because it's pretty weak. So yeah, I have active rook, active knight, good king, and extra pawn, and I could have slowly just won this endgame. I decided to play knight g6, and my opponent didn't exchange it. She went knight h5 because she thought she would have more chances with the knights on the board. I do have a weakness. My h7 pawn is not so great, and white knight can try to win that pawn. But as it turned out, she didn't have time to go after my pawns because she still had more weaknesses in the position. So first I gave the check, rook d3, which forces white king to go back and not be an active defender of g4 pawn anymore. And now after knight e5, it turns out white is just losing another pawn. And the reason is, so there's no rook c4, king cannot protect it. Of course there's no h3 because I take with the rook. And there's another tactic here. I'm sure my opponent thought she had knight f6 from afar, defending g4, and if king e7 they can take knight h7. But because of rook f3, I win a piece, and because of this tactic, white cannot protect g4 pawn, and they just have to give it up. And after taking on g4, this is a pretty simple endgame to win. 2 connected extra pawns. There's no compensation for it at all. And yeah, rooks were exchanged, and my opponent resigned here because she doesn't have a chance to save this game. Alright, so just to sum up a few things in this to learn from this endgame. Number 1, you need to always evaluate position correctly. Even when you only have 10 pieces on the board, it can be tricky to stay objective and give your position objective evaluation. And also the pawn structure is extremely important. As soon as my opponent played g4 after g5, her pawn structure just fell apart, and that cost her the game. And last but not least, tactics in the endgame. They're very common. As you saw in just this simple endgame, there were 3 or 4 times the tactics were the reason black won. Alright, let's take a look at the next example. So, next example is from Kramnik against Hare Krishna game from 2016 Norway Chess. And this time we're going to look at this endgame from Whiteside. Now there are a lot more pieces in this endgame than the last 2 examples I showed you. We've got 2 pair of rooks and 4 minor pieces on the board. Now, again, first and foremost, you need to evaluate the position correctly. Let's start with the material. It's equal. Rooks are about the same, although currently white has a slight advantage of having a rook on the open file. And pieces, this is where it becomes clear that white is better, because white's bishop on b2 controlling a1 h8 diagonal is definitely better than black's bishop on e7. Although black's bishop on e7 is a temporary piece, it can definitely end up on f6 trying to exchange that bishop. So that's a slight advantage that we have a good bishop right now. And knights are about the same, they're both well placed. However, white's knight has better potential, and that's because black has more weaknesses in the position than white does. And that's the next thing we're going to evaluate. The pawns. On the queen side, on the queen side, they're about the same. However, on the king side, black has prematurely pushed f5. Or we don't know if it was premature. It happened sometime in the middle game. But now it's clear that that f5 pawn is the reason black is worse. It has created 3 weaknesses, which are f5 pawn itself, and then e6 and g6 squares. And that's why white knight is better than black's, because white knight has a potential to exploit these weaknesses. And that's what Kramnik did exactly. He started with knight d4. Going to e6, either going to e6 square or taking on f5. So after the evaluation, it's clear white is slightly better, but you still need a very good technical skills to win this kind of endgame. And Kramnik demonstrated fantastic skills to win this endgame. So after knight d4, black decided to exchange 1 pair of rooks so that it would be easier to protect the weaknesses, and white wouldn't have 2 rooks on the open files. And black also centralized the knight, played knight d5, protecting f5, and again creating potential for the knight. It can go to b4 and maybe attack white's weakness, which is an e2 pawn. It's not really a weakness, but it is an unprotected pawn. After knight d5, white played knight e6, hitting both rook on f8 and the pawn on g7. Now black's only move is rook f7 to protect the pawn, and now our rook becomes extremely active, goes to c8, and try to find the next move in this position on your own. So white has, in last 3 moves, white has clearly improved the position. We have definitely an active knight now, and a very strong bishop, and a wonderful rook on c8, while black pieces are kind of cramped, defending all the weaknesses. But what to do next? How to best improve white's position? And the answer is find another weakness and put pressure on that weakness, and Kramnik did just that. Rook a8. The more pieces or squares you attack, the harder it becomes for your opponent to defend, of course. So Kramnik decided to attack on both sides, king and the queen side, which turned out perfect. So rook a8, black can't really defend a6 pawn. If they try to play knight b4, that can be met with a3, and we still win the a6 pawn. So instead, Hare Krishna played f4, went for a counterplay, which is the absolute right choice. Not just in the endgame, but in middle games too. If there's nothing you can do about your material, that you're definitely going to lose it, try to create a counterplay. That's what black is doing here. Rook a6. And here, I personally don't like black's choice, which was to take on g3. In my opinion, black should have tried to play f3. It's not a dangerous move, and on one hand, it actually makes the f3 pawn pretty weak. White can eventually win that pawn. But in my opinion, black's position is already so bad that I think this was their best try, because it forces king to go to the first rank, and king is kind of in an unprotected first rank, where it can get checkmated, but of course not in this position when black's rook is so passive. I just think that having black's pawn on f3 is unpleasant for white. They have to watch out for some kind of tactics to not get checkmated. And it's not always fun to have to watch out for your king, especially in the endgame when king is just as important piece as any other. So yeah, I would have played f3, and even though black is still much worse, I think they can try to create some chances for themselves. But instead, Hare Krishna took on g3 and played bishop f6. So he's just trying to equalize this position in more classical way. But that's hard to do when you're down a pawn and your opponent doesn't have any weaknesses. If white had a serious weak pawn, then I think this would have worked. But all white pawns are extremely safe. f2 and g3 are protecting each other, and we have a king protecting them. a2, b3 very well protected as well by the rook, and there's no way black can easily attack those pawns. But anyway, critical decision, critical moment here after black plays bishop f6. What to do? Exchange the bishops or move the bishop away? And I think it'd be beneficial for you to take your time, pause the video, and think about it yourself. What would you do? What do you think is better, and why? It is very important to know when to exchange your pieces. So the general rule of thumb is that when you're up material, you should exchange pieces. But that's not always the case, of course. It always depends on a position. So here Kramnik chose not to exchange for now and played bishop c1. And I think that was the right choice. If he were to exchange on f6 now, it gives black an active rook, temporarily, but still, and we are pinned on e6, which isn't easy to get out of. That pin is pretty unpleasant, and if we try to get out of the pin right away, then it offers a rook exchange, which again, if you follow the rule of thumb, when you're up material, exchange more pieces, it makes sense. But knight endgames are extremely tricky. Knight endgames are quite often compared to pawn endings, because they're just as delicate as pawn endings. You cannot make any tiny inaccuracy or it'll completely changes the result of the game. So here, even though white's up a pawn and seemingly, what's the problem? Why isn't white just winning this endgame? Well, after black plays move like b4, white is going to have a very hard time winning this endgame and probably won't even win it. The problem is, after b4, I am completely paralyzing your queenside pawns. They can't move on their own anymore. And so is white's knight. It's kind of stuck in the corner. As soon as it moves anywhere, black is going to play knight c3 and win the a2 pawn and equalize material. And of course, white doesn't want that. And if you try to improve your king, which is what you should do, black can play something like h5, and king e4 is king e4 or both king e2. Two moves to centralize the king are bad because of knight c3 fork, winning the a2 pawn. And just to show you what would happen if white, let's say, sacrifices a2 pawn temporarily and goes for b4 pawn. Now suddenly black plays g5 and creates a passed pawn, and white doesn't even have time to take the b4 pawn. Now they have to worry about that passed h pawn, because black might even end up winning. So that's the reason why going to this knight endgame would not have been smart for white. It wasn't obvious at all earlier, especially when we had more pieces, but these pawns, g7 and h6, have a potential for a passed h pawn. So that's why Kramnik decided it was not the right time to exchange the bishops and played bishop c1. Even though bishop on c1 is such an bad-looking piece and just bad-looking move, but it's passive only temporarily. He brought it back in just a couple moves and managed to exchange that bishop at the right time on his terms, just so black wouldn't get an active knight endgame where it's not clear how white can make any progress. So bishop c1, temporarily a passive move. Black played rook e7, rook d6, knight c3, a3. So that was an important improvement, putting pawn on a3 so that black cannot play b4 in any kind of endgame anymore and paralyze our two pawns. So now black tried to bring the king towards the center, and it's time to bring the bishop back to b2. Hare Krishna played rook a7, and now white is ready to exchange some pieces, and you'll see why. So first Kramnik plays rook c6, attacking the knight. Knight goes back. Time to exchange the bishops. Although, if you don't see the next move, you might be asking yourself, well, this doesn't make any sense. Why now? a3 pawn is even weaker than it was before, because black rook is on a file and clearly attacking the pawn. Well, because of next move, which is rook c7, is why this whole line works. Now there is another weakness. Now that black square bishop is gone, g7 pawn is a weakness. And if black takes on c7, then guess what? b5 pawn is weak, and there is no more b4 move. Black knight cannot help to protect that pawn or attack our pawn, so white is going to win a second pawn in the knight endgame, which is of course completely different than the knight endgame we looked at before, with the two protected, connected pawns. That's a very easy win. So rook cannot take on c7, and the game black took on a3, but after rook g7, king h8, king is terribly passive in the corner, and there is another tactical move that wins another pawn, which is rook g6. And now we're trying to have connected pawns on the queen side, but ended up with the connected pawns on the king side, which is not a big problem. It's still completely winning with f and g connected pawns. Black cannot stop those pawns at all. Just few more moves they continue to play, because if black manages to take b3 pawn, then it's not going to be that simple for white to win. They will definitely have counterplay, because that b pawn is a passed pawn, and it's when both rook and knight will be helping to push it further. It's not going to be easy to stop it. So a few more accurate moves to save that pawn. Rook h4, knight d2, and b4. And after this, we keep that pawn, and we're slowly going to start push our pawns. Also, we can even try to win b5 pawn as well, because it's pretty weak. But yeah, good rook, good knight, 2 extra pawns, clearly a winning endgame. And this was such a smooth endgame. In the starting position, doesn't even look like white has that big of an advantage. But with the right understanding of the position, understanding the weaknesses in black's position, and making the correct moves, it was a very smooth win. Black didn't even have to make any bad moves to win this endgame, just white played very nicely. And I would recommend to watch, to go over most of Kramnik's endgames, because he is one of the best endgame players in the world. Alright, let's take a look at the next example. Next example is from a game Gladura versus Anand from Gibraltar Masters 2016. So we have a very classical endgame position, and also very symmetrical as well. And I think this is just a great game to show you so many little things in the endgame that are just general principles that you can use in any type of endgame. So first, let's start with the evaluation as always. We have equal material, pawn structure is almost identical. Knights and bishops, they're about the same. I would say that white's bishop is currently a little better because it's on a better diagonal. But again, that's not even completely true, because who's to say that diagonal is not just as important. So minor pieces are about the same, and then we have rooks. Currently, white's rook is slightly better because it's on open file and black's rook is not, but at the same time, black is just one move away from putting the rook on d8, and white's rook, it's not really that much useful to have a rook on open file if it can't take advantage of it. And by that I mean, if white cannot play rook d7 or rook d6 and attack anything, then it's not really a great rook. And since black is controlling d5, d6, d7, d8 squares, this rook is not that great. It's just a good looking rook. So position is almost identical and very equal. However, white managed to outplay Anand in this endgame. So let's take a look how white managed to win this endgame. First, starting with king f1, activating king, because I'm sure you already know this. If you don't, it's rule number 1 in the endgame. King becomes just as important as any other piece, and by that I mean in the opening and in the middle game we try so hard to protect our king that you might forget that in the endgame you can bring it out and use it to win the game. King can participate in the center very nicely. So king f1, black plays a6 so that a7 pawn isn't hanging when they try to play rook d8. Now prophylaxis move h3 to avoid knight g4 jumps attacking bishop on e3 and the pawn on h2. So first we tried to make our king better, then we stopped to make one prophylaxis move. So it's a very slow progress, trying to squeeze out an advantage out of this equal position. White played b3, rook d8, and one can say this is a critical moment, because exchanging rooks is a critical decision. And yeah, white decided to exchange them here. Another option would have been rook c1, so try to have a different open file while black controls the d file. And I would say it's still very, very, very close to equal. It's just a different way to play. White thought that they would have better chances after rook d8. So now we transition to minor piece ending. but evaluation of the position is still the same. Symmetrical pawns, slightly better minor pieces, and also slightly better king for white. Now here, Anand played this move h5, which I'm not sure is the best move, although I do understand the reason behind it. Quite often putting pawns this way is the best way you can display your kingside pawns. That way they protect each other well, and f7 pawn is the only weak one, and you can protect it with the king. So I'm assuming that was Anand's plan, to just play h5, g6, and have a very solid kingside pawn structure. But turns out that allows white to play bishop g5 and force some exchanges, which again doesn't seem so terrible, because black's both bishop and knight are absolutely fine, and it's not clear why any kind of exchange should be something black should avoid.